If people have told you you're too sensitive your whole life, they're wrong. And in the next minute, you'll understand why. Because if you cry easily, it's not because you're weak. It's not because you're dramatic. It's not because you're trying to get attention. Honestly, if you wanted attention, you'd be doing what everyone else does, posting hot takes at 2 a.m. Like it's a public service. No, what usually happens is quieter than that. You have a normal conversation, nothing big even happened, you smile, you nod, you say you're fine, you walk away, and 10 minutes later your throat tightens. And you're standing there thinking, why am I like this? Why can't I just be normal? Then the shame kicks in. The mental replay starts. You scan the conversation frame by frame like a detective, looking for the exact moment you became too much. And the worst part is, people act like crying is a character flaw. Like the ideal human is someone who's loud, confident, socially unstoppable, and emotionally bulletproof. Because apparently the goal is to feel nothing, but feel it loudly. Let me say this clearly, and you can borrow this sentence whenever you need it. You are not too sensitive. You are underexplained. You didn't overreact. You processed more than they did. And if you've been carrying that shame for years, thinking you're built wrong, I need you to hear this like a friend would. You're not broken, you're just not numb. Now here's the part nobody tells you. When people call you too sensitive, they're usually not diagnosing you. They're describing their own discomfort. Because your emotions make them feel something, and they don't like that. So instead of learning how to handle their own reaction, they label you. Too sensitive. Too emotional. Too intense. And it's funny, in a sad way, how society worships empathy in movies, then punishes it in real life. They want kind, but only the convenient kind. The quiet kind. The kind that never cries, never needs, never pauses the party. Which is why if you're the person who feels deeply, you've probably been pressured to shrink, to tone it down, to toughen up, to stop caring. Like caring is a hobby you should quit. But listen, if your heart reacts fast, it's often because it notices things other people skip. And that is not weakness. That is sensitivity doing its job. So before we go deeper, I want you to hold on to one truth. This is going to be one of those sentences people remember, because it explains their whole life in one breath. Being sensitive isn't the problem. Being sensitive in a world that shames sensitivity is the problem. Now, let me show you the lie you've been fed and why it keeps hurting you. Here's the lie you've been quietly fed for years. Sensitivity equals weakness. Not officially, of course. No one says it out loud like that. They say it in nicer ways. You need thicker skin. You take things too personally. You're reading too much into it. Which is fascinating, because no one ever tells loud, emotionally careless people that they should read more into things. Think about it. We live in a world that rewards speed, noise, confidence, and certainty. The louder you are, the more secure you seem. The faster you react, the more strong you look. Pausing is suspicious. Feeling deeply is inconvenient. Crying is treated like a system error. Because this world loves performance, not processing. So when someone like you feels something deeply, you break the illusion, you slow the room down, you add emotional weight. You remind people that words land somewhere. And that makes people uncomfortable. Not because you're wrong, but because you're real. Here's a sentence that tends to hit people hard. Most people don't hate sensitivity. They hate what sensitivity reveals. It reveals tone. It reveals tension. It reveals things everyone else is trying to ignore, which is why the label shows up. You're too sensitive. Translation. Please stop noticing things I don't want to deal with, and the irony is brutal. The same society that celebrates emotional intelligence on LinkedIn actively punishes emotional awareness in daily life. They want empathy, just not in real time. They want honesty, just not when it's uncomfortable. They want depth, as long as it stays quiet and doesn't interrupt the schedule. So, if you grew up sensitive, you probably learned this lesson early. It's safer to doubt yourself than to question the room. It's easier to assume you're flawed than to accept that the environment is emotionally careless. So you adapted. You minimized. You apologized for reactions you didn't fully understand yet. You learned to swallow emotions quickly and release them later alone. Which is why you don't usually cry in front of people. You cry after. In the car. In the shower. In your room, replaying moments that everyone else already forgot. And let me be very clear here. That doesn't make you fragile. It means your nervous system doesn't skip steps. You don't jump straight to indifference. You go through meaning first. Here's a line people tend to screenshot because it explains the disconnect perfectly. Insensitive people feel less and call it strength. Sensitive people feel more and call it a flaw. And that belief sits quietly in your head for years, until you start wondering if something is wrong with you. It isn't. But the misunderstanding doesn't stop there. Because the next part is where everything clicks, and where most people finally understand why they cry for no reason. Let's talk about what's actually happening inside you. Why you cry easily, and what's actually happening inside you. Here's the part no one ever explains properly. You don't cry easily because you're weak. You cry easily because you process emotion all the way through. Most people feel something, get uncomfortable, and shut it down halfway. They distract themselves. They joke. They scroll. They move on without finishing the emotional loop. You don't. Your system stays with the feeling until it completes, and sometimes completion looks like tears. That's it. No drama, no character flaw. Just a nervous system doing its job. Here's a sentence that usually lands hard. Crying is often the body finishing a process the mind hasn't caught up with yet. You might not even know what you're crying about in the moment. You just feel full, heavy, tight. That's because your body already understands something your thoughts are still circling. Now add one more layer. Sensitive people don't just feel their own emotions. They absorb the room, tone, subtext, micro-reactions, the pause before someone answers. The shift in energy when a sentence lands wrong, you pick it all up. Which means even when a conversation seems normal, you're processing 10 invisible things at once. Most people walk away from an interaction with one data point. You walk away with 12. And later, when your system finally slows down, those 12 things show up. All at once, that's why the tears feel sudden. They aren't sudden at all. They're delayed. Society calls that overreacting. But let's be honest. Overreacting would be screaming in the moment. Throwing things. Making a scene, you didn't do that. You held it together, you stayed polite, you stayed functional. And then your body asked for its turn. Here's another line people tend to keep. You didn't cry because the moment was big. You cried because you carried it quietly. And this is where the misunderstanding gets cruel. People see the tears, but they never see the effort it took to delay them. They judge the release, not the restraint. So you start telling yourself stories, I'm too emotional. I shouldn't feel this much. Something is wrong with me. Nothing is wrong with you. What's missing is context. And that context changes everything. But before we talk about the strength hidden inside this, we need to address the part that hurts the most. The way people misunderstand you. And what that does to your sense of self over time. That's where things really start to click. Being misunderstood and the quiet damage it leaves behind. Here's the part people don't talk about, because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Being misunderstood doesn't just hurt once, it teaches you to doubt yourself slowly. When people repeatedly misread your sensitivity, you don't just feel hurt, you start editing yourself. You replay moments in your head and think, maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe I shouldn't feel this way. And that's dangerous. Because sensitivity doesn't disappear when you suppress it, it just turns inward. So instead of questioning the situation, you question yourself. Instead of thinking, that comment was sharp, you think, why am I like this? That's the quiet damage. And it usually starts early. You learn that crying makes people uncomfortable. You learn that needing space looks like weakness. You learn that explaining your feelings feels like asking for permission. So you adapt. You become the low-maintenance one. The one who says, it's fine, even when it isn't. The one who feels deeply but carries it privately, so no one else has to deal with it. Here's a line that stops people cold. You weren't too sensitive. You were just surrounded by people who didn't listen deeply. And the world reinforces that. We praise emotional control, but we confuse control with suppression. We admire people who never cry, then wonder why they're disconnected, reactive, or numb later. And somewhere along the way, you absorbed the message that your way of feeling was something to fix. So you tried to harden yourself. You told yourself to stop caring, to stop reacting, to toughen up. But all that did was make you tired. Because pretending not to feel takes more energy than feeling honestly ever will. Here's the truth most people miss. Being misunderstood hurts more than being criticized. Criticism is loud. Misunderstanding is quiet, and quiet things linger. If you're listening to this and thinking, yes, that's exactly it, you're not alone. A lot of people who feel deeply grow up believing they're the problem. They aren't. The problem is that no one taught them how to protect their sensitivity without erasing it. And that's where everything shifts. Because sensitivity without boundaries feels like pain. But sensitivity with boundaries becomes something else entirely, something strong. Let's talk about that next. When sensitivity becomes strength, not pain, here's the turning point most people never reach. Sensitivity isn't meant to be removed. It's meant to be directed. The pain you felt didn't come from feeling deeply. It came from feeling deeply for everyone all the time without protection. Sensitive people don't suffer because they feel more. They suffer because they feel without boundaries. And no one teaches you this part. So you grow up thinking the only two options are feel everything and hurt or feel nothing and survive. But there's a third option. Feel deeply, selectively. Here's a sentence people tend to stop on. Sensitivity without boundaries feels like drowning. Sensitivity with boundaries feels like clarity. Boundaries don't make you colder. They make you precise. They decide what gets access to you and what doesn't. And this is where society gets it wrong again. They assume boundaries are aggressive, cold, unkind, but real boundaries are quiet. They sound like, I need time before responding. I don't explain myself to people who don't listen. I don't absorb emotions that aren't mine. Which is ironic, because the loudest people often have the weakest boundaries, and the quietest people carry everyone else's weight. If you're sensitive, your strength shows up differently. You notice patterns before others do. You sense shifts before they become problems. You feel when something is off long before anyone can explain why. That's not fragility. That's perception. But perception without limits turns into exhaustion. So here's the reframe that changes everything. You don't need to feel less. You need to filter better. And once you do, something surprising happens. The same sensitivity that once overwhelmed you starts guiding you. It helps you choose people more carefully. It helps you leave situations earlier. It helps you trust your internal signals instead of arguing with them. And suddenly, you're not crying because you're confused anymore. You're crying less because you understand yourself more. Now, before we close this out, there's one last thing I want to say because it's where a lot of people quietly get stuck. And it has nothing to do with weakness at all. The quiet truth people don't tell you, here's the truth that usually lands last, but changes how people see themselves forever. The world doesn't need less sensitivity. It needs people who know how to carry it. Right now, we have plenty of loud opinions, fast reactions, and confident answers. What we're missing is depth. We're missing people who pause before speaking. People who notice emotional undercurrents. People who feel the weight of words before throwing them into the room. And yes, those people cry more easily. Not because they're fragile, but because they're connected. Connection costs something. If you feel deeply, you pay that cost up front instead of passing it to others later. Here's a sentence that tends to stay with people. Sensitive people don't avoid pain. They just refuse to outsource it. And that's why the label never fit you. You weren't too sensitive. You were too honest for environments that preferred numbness. Too aware for spaces that rewarded noise. Too real for systems built on emotional shortcuts. So if you've spent years thinking you need to toughen up, shrink yourself, or become less than you are, let me say this plainly. You don't need to be fixed. You need to be understood, starting with yourself. Now, let me finish this. You don't owe the world emotional silence. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that hurts less to be around. The right spaces won't call you too sensitive. They'll call you perceptive, thoughtful, human. And if this video felt uncomfortably accurate, that's not coincidence. It's recognition. You're not weak. You're not broken. And they were wrong about you. That's all.